Hi there. Welcome back to Tiff Reads Books. I am Tiff, and I read books, and I talk about them. So, I want to talk about my 23 in 23 book list that I made and what I learned from it. I made this list in December of 2022 based off of books that I had purchased because I thought I would like, and some YouTuber recommendations and some Instagram recommendations. And my goal was to branch myself out, read some new things, and maybe rekindle my love of reading that got lost while doing my PhD and reading a ton of required reading. So, I learned some things. I have one book left. That is The Institute, which is upstairs because I started it last night. But it is a Stephen King book, and I'm probably not going to learn a whole lot from it because I've kind of got the vibe of what I feel about Stephen King recently by doing all my rereads. So that'll be another video. So we're not going to worry about that one. But I have branched out to a few different categories, and I learned what I liked and what I didn't like. So I'm going to talk about them in a specific order because one of the things that I learned that I didn't like is Romantasy. So I don't have any of these books. Oh no, I do have one of them. Fantasy that I read was The Witch's Heart, and I hated it. I thought I would love it because I have a thing for Norse mythology. I'm really interested in it, and especially Loki's children. That was like always a big interest of mine. I have a tattoo of Jormungandr. Like, I have an affinity for those things. So I was really disappointed by this book because you cannot convince me that that book was not Marvel Loki fanfic. Like, what if we took Marvel's Loki and we put him into the actual Norse mythology pantheon? And then it became like this like late 90s sitcom type thing where he was like a deadbeat dad who just came home and got the kids riled up, and then she had to deal with all of it, and they were all like, we love dad, he's our favorite, and then mom's mean and she's bossy, and I couldn't handle it. She was like, Angrboda is the main character, and the author said that they wanted to show her as more than just monster mommy. And then they made her literally just monster mommy. And I was like, she's this all-powerful witch. And we're making her be like swoon over this man because he has curly hair. Like, I couldn't do it. So, not for me. The writing was also really descriptive. Every like chapter started with, then one day, then one time, then the sun came up. And I was like, why are we starting every chapter with like then? It was just, it wasn't a writing style I liked. I went on a very long rant about it. I have lots of opinions on it. You can't convince me that it's not fanfic. Doesn't matter how much the author says that it is not fanfic and that it is based on the true Norse mythology, which she studied in college. It's fanfic. Okay, so second one was For the Wolf, which I also had a big issue with. Dog needs to pick a spot. Hugin. My dog's name is also Hugin, and he's 12 years old, so that was like pre like Marvel Loki. Anyway, so For the Wolf. Supposedly it was a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I was really confused about whether it was or not. Some people said it was a Red Riding Hood retelling, but like the official stuff I could find, it was supposed to be Beauty and the Beast retelling. The only thing I could figure out was there was like an enchanted forest, and this guy was supposed to be kind of like beastie. I did not enjoy it. I didn't like the story. I didn't like the writing. I didn't like... this is, according to my friend who reads romance, it's the miscommunication trope or the non-communication trope. Like, if these people would just talk to each other, everything would be fine. And I couldn't... The tension could be so easily fixed with just people talking to each other. So I couldn't. And then the one that I'm kind of considering Romantasy because I DNF'd this one partway through. So as far as I got, it was a Romantasy. I could probably consider this gothic horror-y. But even though I like horror, I struggled with this one. Because the main character has some pretty horrible self-image stuff and some intrusive thoughts that come along with that I just resonated too much with and couldn't really deal with at the time. So because I read the content warnings for this, which include like abusive parent, forced like confinement, and I was like, yeah, that's fine. I did not see anything about the ED stuff. So she has a pretty severe binge eating disorder, and then a pretty severe body image stuff that goes along with that. And if we had been like viewing this as a horror, I probably could have handled it, but because it's in this romance kind of thing, I struggled and I just needed to put it aside. So I got like 86 pages into that and was like, I don't think I can. I have opinions on Ava Reid. I'm gonna give them one more try next year, because I have read 2 books, well, DNF'd one, finished the other one through and did not like it, and I will be reading a 3rd one next year, and we'll see. Okay, so those are the romantasies. So I learned that I do not like romantasy. Okay, so moving on to fantasies, which I learned I do really like. So before, most of my intro to fantasy was someone trying to get me to read the Wheel of Time series, and I struggled with his writing style. It was really, really detailed, and the pacing didn't work for me. I might give it a try again, but when I read it when I was like 16, it's the first book I DNF'd. I also read A Game of Thrones, the first book, A Game of Thrones, and it took me 6 months because it was the same overly detailed writing style. So up until this year, that was really all I'd tried, along with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which is very fantasy, and that is like one of my favorite things. So I was like, I know there's some fantasy that I like, and I had read The Eyes of the Dragon, and I really liked that. So I knew there had to be fantasy I liked. So everyone had been telling me to read Pratchett, and I decided, because you can read the Discworld in pretty much any order, they all work as standalones for the most part, from what I had searched on Wikipedia, and I decided I would let the universe decide which one I would read first. So every time I went to a secondhand store, I looked for a Pratchett book, and I found The Thief of Time, which is actually at my friend's house because I loaned it to her and she hasn't finished it yet. So I read The Thief of Time in January and fell absolutely in love with Terry Pratchett's writing style. So I learned that I love Pratchett, fantasy, and comedy in books when it's well done. So then I read, let's see, in February I read Hooked. Not the TikTok one. I read this one, which I had bought. I bought on my last trip to the UK. I discovered that I had a Waterstones gift card for my Viva celebration that I had never activated because I left the country like 5 days after my Viva celebration or something like that, and I didn't want to be bringing a bunch of books with me. So I still had like 40 pounds on the card. So I bought this one, and The Woman in Black, which is a kind of gothic horror that I really recommend. I really liked that one. But I read this one this year and didn't really like it. There was like a whole thing about the author not realizing that crocodiles can live in salt water. And that bothered me from the beginning. Anyway, this was not one of my favorites. The writing style was confusing. We kept being reminded that Hook has a hook on one of his hands. The author was like, he reached out and grabbed it with his hand, not the wooden one. I was like, okay, thanks. And then she was like, he reached out and touched him with his hand, not the wooden one. Gotcha. Okay. Like, I kind of struggled. This was basically, this still is a what if Peter Pan was the villain, and Hook escaped afterward, and we also made Hook gay, which was kind of an interesting twist, and I kind of liked it. And he was like severely scarred and traumatized from his experience in Neverland, and it had a good premise. So it's not the worst thing I've read this year. In February I was really upset with it, but then I've read things that are way worse. So in context, I gave this a 3, and it's a 3. I read The Book of Dust by Phil Pullman, which is it's the first book in the Book of Dust series, so La Belle Sauvage, which I had bought years ago when it came out. I pre-ordered it. This is the first time that I'd ever realized that people could do these cool things. It's like all sparkly under the dust jacket, because it was like first edition. But I started reading it in like 100-degree weather, and some of the pages fell out. So I put it aside and I never finished it until this year, and I really enjoyed this for a YA story. I thought it was really good, a nice little adventure story. And then I read Stephen King's Fairy Tale. I feel like Fairy Tale is what Stephen King wanted to do with The Talisman, with Charlie being Jack. It was, I have mixed feelings on it. I gave it a 4, but I also have like mixed feelings on like whether or not I actually feel like that, because I did at the time, but now I'm like, maybe it might be less, because I don't know, there were some weird tropes in there that I didn't like. I might talk more in depth about it when I do my Stephen King stuff, but boy goes into a portal into another world to save his dog, Radar, who is the goodest girl ever, and I loved her, and she like made the story. But there were some weird things that I wasn't a really big fan of. Babel. I'm not gonna grab all these down. Babel's up there. I read Babel, and that was a kind of historical fantasy, and I like set in a specific time. I would also call it a little bit gothic because we kind of revolved around this building, and like it was interesting, and I really liked it, and I think R.F. Kuang is a really good writer, and I'm looking forward to reading more of her stuff. I did a video on Babel, so you could check that one out if you want to hear more of my thoughts about it, but I really enjoyed it. The mishmash of language and how languages evolve, and with some magic in there, and the historical context of racism and colonialism and academia, and I have some heavy thoughts on academia as an institution and how it does uphold racism and colonialism and sexism as well. And I think Babel did a really good job of talking about all of those in a very accessible, not preachy way. And I really enjoyed that. And it did a lot of unexpected things. So I enjoyed that. And then Legends and Lattes, which is out of my boyfriend's truck because he's reading it. And I really enjoyed that one too. A different type of fantasy to what I've read before. Definitely kind of cozy and kind of slow. And it's just like, it was like here's my characters, they're really cute and I love them and I hope that you love them too. And I was like, yes, I do love those characters, please give me more. Like, so I really enjoyed that, and that kind of taught me that I am someone who likes characters over plot. As long as the plot makes sense, I don't need there to be a whole lot of it. I just need it to make sense. And I don't necessarily like stories that are heavy plot with no character, because I need to feel invested in the characters. Otherwise, I don't care about the plot unless I care about the characters. So that's kind of what I learned from the fantasy books that I read. I don't think, as far as the fantasies, I liked all of them. And I think that was kind of my issue with the romantasies, is apart from like The Witch's Heart, we didn't really have a lot of time with the characters themselves, I think. So I don't know. I have some interesting thoughts on that. Okay, so switching completely. Well, we could go into the sci-fi speculative, so that we kind of make a trend. So I read Africa Risen, which is a collection of short stories. A lot of them were based on African myth, which was really interesting. Those ones I really enjoyed. There was a couple of sci-fi ones that are Afrofuturism, and I really enjoyed those. But then there were others that just didn't hit for me. So it was a 3 kind of overall, and from that, and currently reading the short story collection I'm reading right now, I struggle with short story collections when they bounce around from different authors. Some of my favorite Stephen King books are short story collections, so I thought I would like them, but the bouncing back around between different authors kind of doesn't keep my attention as well as I would think it would. So, and then I read The Light Pirate, kind of sci-fi because it's climate change anxiety like in a book, and I absolutely love this. We follow Wanda, who's named after a hurricane, and we literally follow her whole life and all of the trauma that she deals with as the climate in Florida is changing. And I was obsessed. I cried, and I also was like giddy, and like there's a little romance in here that is sapphic, and that was really cute. There's an adorable scene with manatees and like these like glowing lights, and it was just so like, it was so wholesome and traumatizing at the same time. And I kept being reminded I kept viewing the characters, like thinking of them in the art style of Treasure Planet, and it works. Like it works. So yeah, I really liked that one, and that kind of got me into like thinking about some more speculative type fiction kind of story. I liked it because it was a story that followed a character. Like it just followed her and her life, and I really loved that. The last sci-fi I read was actually my first book of the year. I had picked it up at a Goodwill. It was called The Cure. It had some really good reviews online. It was a YA dystopian book that was set in the future, at the same time set in, I think, the 1300s. with one of the first genocides of Jewish people, basically. And so it was kind of rough reading that. But I gave it a really low score because I didn't like the author's writing style. I struggled with it. It was really narrative, and did not work for me. There was like a scene where it was like, I walked into the house and I looked on the shelf. There was a stick on the shelf. I asked about the stick on the shelf. I asked if I could use the donkey. He said yes. And it was like, what? Why are we talking like this? It was so weird. But it was your standard YA dystopian, well, before Hunger Games and all that type of stuff, because this was older, where we need to show that a society without love is not a society, was essentially like the point of it, with also giving you a pretty good historical context for religious persecution, and that's valuable. But it was a struggle to read, so I did not enjoy that one. It has a higher ranking on Goodreads and Storygraph than I gave it, so it might be something that some people like, but I did not like it. It was the writing style for me. Also the fact that there was a literal pissing contest in the book, which was so weird. So we can move from there into thrillers. I read 3 thrillers. I'm calling one a thriller. So I read What Lies in the Woods and was obsessed with it. I'm pretty happy to see that on the Goodreads Choice Awards because it was so good and I enjoyed it so much. And then, so that follows 3 girls, and it basically, for me, like, the synopsis is little girls are feral. And I just love that for us. So, it was so twisty, and we followed a woman who was dealing with some pretty severe, complex PTSD, but also dealing with that layer into her life and some heavy scarring from what happened to her when she was a kid. And it's so good. It's so good. And then All the Dangerous Things, which I also really liked, and I think that's in the Goodreads Choice Awards this year too. But I voted for What Lies in the Woods because it's just so much better. So All the Dangerous Things follows a woman whose son has been stolen, and it like breaks apart her marriage, and she's trying to find him. And the twists in it are maybe expected, but also really well done. There's a lot of discussion of postpartum depression and what that can cause to relationships and stuff, and so I really enjoyed that. Pretty darker than I expected it to be. I also, with What Lies in the Woods, it's set in the Pacific Northwest, and me being from the Pacific Northwest, I was just like, yes, oh, give me all of the rainy, foggy forest vibes. Last one is Joyland, and I'm counting this as a mystery thriller. I know it's in the horror category because as soon as you say Stephen King, people shelve on Goodreads as horror. It is not a horror. There is a ghost story and there is a twist. It's like trying to discover who murdered this woman. That it's not horror, it's a thriller. It has another weird Stephen King trope in it, which is this whole thing about a younger guy being obsessed with losing his virginity, which is just so early 2000s. And so Stephen King, but the characters, and we're just following this main character, whose name I can't remember for the life of me right now, but we're just following him in the summer that he like really grows up, and he's obsessed with losing his virginity that summer, but it's really actually like the job that he gets that makes him grow up, and I really enjoyed it. Yeah, is good. So thrillers I kind of always knew I liked, but this like solidified that thrillers are for me. Then the horror. So I did include some horror, branching out to new authors, and I did find some stuff that I liked and some stuff I didn't like. So I read what I DNF'd that's counted as horror. I still don't know where to count it. Horror or fantasy, or sometimes it's shelved under gothic, but I don't think it is. Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series. I started reading them in my early 20s, and I've loved some of them and disliked some of the other ones. My favorite is Memnoch the Devil. It is kind of like Dante's Inferno, but with Lestat, and I just love that Lestat is such a moody bitch. Oh my god, and I love him. I love that he spent like 100 years just like laying on the floor of a temple, like, or a cathedral, just being like, please let me die, just laying on the floor getting covered in dust. Like, he's such a dramatic bitch. And the fact that he at one point tried to throw himself into the sun because he was just like, fuck this, I can't do it anymore, and like threw himself into the sun and survived. So then he just laid on the floor of the Sahara Desert for like years to try to die. Like, he's just such a dramatic bitch, and I love him. This one I did not like. So I read Merrick last year, which I think is book 7 or 8, and then Blood and Gold is 8 or 9. Merrick, I had some issues with. The video is not about Merrick, but I had issues with it because we had a little bit of like a pedo-y trope where one of our main characters, David, he has been put into a vampire body, but before that he was like a 70-year-old man. So he is one of the vampires who's actually lived the longest as a human before becoming a vampire. And during the Tale of the Body Thief, he got a younger body. And he is part of the secret society that knows about the vampires and all sorts of other supernatural things. So he has been involved with the Mayfair witches, and Merrick is kind of adjacently related to the Mayfair witches because she is black, we're in the American South, and racism. So she's like part of a separate family that is kind of tangentially related because of slavery. So when Merrick is like 13, she gets brought to the secret society for protection because her guardians have died. And David says some very weird things about how pretty she is. And I'm like, she is 13. And he says some really disgusting things. And the fact that this is our only like person of color in the books so far, apart from our monster mommy and who's Egyptian. But beyond that, everyone is white as fuck. And our only black character, who already has a traumatic past, is now being sexualized as a child by our main character, who we're supposed to really like. And then Merrick grows up big and strong and badass, and I love her. And then when she's like 20, she decides to sleep with David, who's like 65. And I guess we were supposed to be like, yay, they got together. But I was just like, gross, you groomed her. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. So, somehow, some reason decided to continue with the series, hoping it got better. And it did not. Blood and Gold was worse, so I DNF'd it because Marius, who is a centuries-old vampire, though we are talking about when he's a little bit younger because we're back in Rome, and Marius has always been kind of weird because he's the one that turned Armand when Armand was like 14, and he kept young boys for his pleasure, which was horrifying reading The Vampire Armand, and I'm so glad the movie aged him up. Because that would have been, Claudio was already an issue, and then having Armand be young too. Whew. Okay, Marius is even worse. There was a line that was like, he couldn't stop kissing her baby woman skin, and I was like, that's it, I'm done. So, I learned I don't like Anne Rice, and that woman is weird and writes some weird ass shit. Will I continue with the series? Maybe, because I'm a completionist, but also I'm just like ready to DNF each book as it disgusts me. As Anne Rice, that's what I learned. Moving on. We'll start with my 5s. Okay. Our Wives Under the Sea. Loved it. Oh my god, like still gives me chills thinking about it. The ambiance of it, the using the different littoral zones of the ocean as like the chapter or the part titles, and just it being written from 2 characters' perspective where we kept going back. Fisheries biologist, terrified of the water, especially deep water. You can't see anything in because my brain makes up shit like this happening. So when she's like stuck in a submarine, also claustrophobic. So her being stuck in a submarine under the ocean, perfect vibes for me. Loved it. Obsessed with it. Absolutely obsessed with it. Couldn't stop talking about it for like 2 months after I read it. Like, still think about it randomly. We'll probably reread it next year. Need to buy it. Because I got it from the library. So freaking good. Okay. What Moves the Dead? Another one that's ambiance and fungus and gothic and a non-binary main character and like representation, and like they were both like representation heavy, and just like it was so good to see story, like reading Stephen King again. I keep going back to it. Everyone's like straight and white except for his magical black person trope, which is a whole other thing I could talk about. Loved it. So from those two being like my tops, I learned grief, stories about grief, and then Monstrilio, which was a book about grief. It was a grief, the horror of grief just speaks to me. So I learned that. And then I read, The Only Good Indians. So again, some representation. That one was so weird that for me, like, finding the rhythm in the speech pattern of the narrator was like, took me a minute. And then when I settled into it, I was like, okay, we could be setting up like an unreliable narrator. And we were. So not to spoil it, but everyone in there is extremely unreliable. And it made sense once it clicked with me that, okay, this is an unreliable narrator. That's why the things that we're getting told don't make sense. And we were kind of following someone reaching their breaking point. And when he snaps. And I was like, it literally is when I set the book down and went, what the fuck? Literally, what the fuck? Like, just, and then picked it up and couldn't stop reading it again. So it took me a bit to get to that point, but once I did, I just like flew through the rest. And then like just the things that happened were so horrific. And then the person who survived and the way that they survived and who it was, and I was just like, oh my God, yes. Like, so good. Again, this was grief and loss and family trauma. Like, this was family trauma as horror, and absolutely loved it. And the diverse voices and experiences and things that, like, it's just so good. So good. I loved it. And then, The Weight of Blood. So this is a Stephen King retelling by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a YA horror. And I was okay. I gave it like a 3.5. It's a little above. I don't know what didn't do it for me with this one. I think it was I remember. It was the literal line, Maddie was not like other girls. And I just was like, come on. It's 2023, although this was written in like 2020, but still, it's 2020. Okay? Like, can we stop? Can we stop using that phrase? That was the other thing that pissed me off about The Cure, too. We literally had Marguerite was not like other girls, like, written in there. And I'm like, that one I gave a little pass because it was older, but I'm just like, I can't. Like, Maddie is very obviously not like other girls because she's the Carrie stand-in. She has telekinesis. So, yeah. But I was just like, oh my God, can we not? So, other than that, I mean, that was like the big thing that I didn't like. I liked the retelling from a different perspective with a different setting, and I thought it was really unique. I liked that it was still epistolary, and we still had but we bumped it up in time where we had podcasts talking about it, and I really liked that. I liked the ideas. Some of the character interactions just didn't do it for me. And that could be because it's YA, and YA is like hit or miss for me. So, okay. The two I didn't like. It Rides a Pale Horse. This author used so many pop culture references that I was like, I get it. You're my age. I get it. Can we stop now? It was supposed to be eldritch horror-y, and it had some good elements to that, and it was like this big reveal of the bad guy, and then he died. I was not impressed. I'm so mad about this book. Okay, so yeah. And then the other one I read was A House at the Bottom of a Lake. And I feel really bad like saying this, but I hated this book. Oh my God. So this is Josh Mallerman, and I guess he's kind of hit or miss for people, but so this is one where it's very horror movie-esque, right? So it's two kids, 17-year-olds, and we're reminded throughout the entire book, but they were 17. And I was like, I get it, they're 17. And they find this house that's at the bottom of this lake, like a full-ass house, and they go down and try to explore it. And it's really weird because they get this old-ass scuba suit to do it, like old-ass scuba suit. And then they're like falling in love at the same time as they're like discovering the house, and then they like built this raft so that they could sleep on this raft on top of the house. And of course the house ends up to be haunted, and the haunting is triggered by them, like, every time they nearly have sex, the house, like, tries to kill them. And it was so weird. And then it was another thing where, like, okay, so dark water makes me uncomfortable. I was feeling so anxious, right? Feeling anxious, the dark water, there's some sort of haunting. It's claustrophobic because we're under the water and we're having to deal with oxygen tanks. And before that, we're just holding our breath and there's like these long hallways. And I was like feeling closed in and I was like, okay, this is terrifying. And then we had the reveal and I was like, that's it? That's it. And it just broke everything for me. And it was more about like, I think this was more about kind of the obsession that happens with the young love and like trying to get that feeling back, because once they like gave up on the house, they like didn't care about each other anymore, and then they're like obsessed with trying to find the house again, and it like appears on the street at the end of it, and then they like hold hands again, and I was like, okay, so some sort of like, but it just didn't do it for me. I was so upset, so upset. So I don't have that one anymore. Like that one's in a box to go. Okay, so yeah, that's what I learned from 22 of the 23 books that I read this year. And I'll give you my Stephen King thoughts later. I have like 2 more rereads I want to do and finish The Institute, and then I want to talk before the end of the year about what I've learned about Stephen King and my relationship to it this year, and then I have a couple more Stephen King things I want to do next year. But yeah, so that is my 23 books in 2023. I recommend doing this type of thing. Make yourself a list that is different than things that you've read. I think next year I'm not going to make a specific list, but I'm going to do 24 books from 24 diverse authors. So I want to get some BIPOC authors, some Asian authors, some diversity in ableness and gender and sexuality and that type of stuff, like some really diverse stories. And I'm not gonna like pick them ahead of time. I'm going to pick them every month and just try to branch out a little bit more in terms of voices. So I recommend doing that. If you have any thoughts on any of these books, I'm gonna put all the pictures up here as we're going. If you have any thoughts on any of these books, do let me know, because I'm always curious what other people think. So thanks for sticking around. If you like this video, give it a like, subscribes, and subscriptions and comments are always welcome. And I will see you soon.